Welcome everybody to a brand new episode of IDTALK4ED Educators Live, the show for the unsung heroes of education. I'm your host, Sarfo-Mensah. And if this is your first time tuning in to the podcast, I welcome you and I hope that you return for future episodes, especially after this one that I know you'll enjoy. And if you are a returning listener or viewer of the podcast, I welcome you back. And I hope that today's episode is one that you find informative, enlightening, and as always, insightful. So before we get to the main event today, just as a reminder, if you are on YouTube, make sure you hit that red subscribe button to get future notifications on new episodes of the podcast. If you're tuning in from Apple Podcasts or Spotify or wherever you listen to your podcast, make sure you subscribe there as well. We also accept any monetary donations or contributions to help us grow this podcast through Cash App and Venmo. So if you're on Cash App, our handle is IDTALK4ED. And if you're on Venmo, our handle is at KwameSM. That's at symbol KWAMESM. And to catch up on past episodes of the podcast. And right now, we have well over 140 episodes over a span of 3.5 years. So if you want to catch up on the history of this podcast, you can go to our main website at IDTALK4EDucators.com. And as always, thank you all for the support. So for those who have not been following my recent excursions, I just got back from a long trip in Hanoi, Vietnam, where the ALOC conference took place. Shout out to ALOC for making history that weekend. We had lots of participants from all over the globe, lots of international educators doing some transformative work in the name of diversity, equity, inclusion, and justice. And it was just refreshing to be in that space and to be able to be in community with such brilliant education minds. So I'm thankful for that journey, thankful for the time and the space, and I'm glad to be here with you all once again on this podcast, introducing you all to another phenomenal guest. So as you all know, what's been transpiring on the Gaza Strip, we're now in day, I believe, 125. Last time I checked, over 28,000 people have been killed. And most of these people are young children, innocent bystanders who are in the crossfires of what's going on. And it's important for us to continue to name what's happening, because regardless of where we stand in terms of religious affiliation, in terms of just racial affiliation, whatever identities you hold, the fact that you have innocent bystanders losing their lives every day should be enough for us to continue to amplify what's going on. So today's guest is somebody who's going to help us do that, but also share her own personal story of how she became an educator and got caught and got involved in the work that she's doing right now. When we talk about diversity, equity, inclusion, and justice, she is about that life. She is about the work, and it is an honor to have her on the podcast today. So without further ado, I want to bring on Abeer Ramadan-Shinnawi to the podcast to talk with us about her journey and just to share how she got here today. So let's bring Abeer on. Hello.
Hello, Kwame. Thank you for having me on the show.
Well, thank you for accepting the invitation. It's an honor. How are you feeling?
I'm actually excited today. When I saw your invitation and my, first of all, I think it was my Instagram DM. I was like, okay, this is what I want, because I told you I've been fangirling. I've been following your work as well. So this is
Thank
exciting.
you.
Today is my birthday. So what better way to, spend some time on my birthday than sharing community with you. So for now, I'm feeling all right.
Yes. And just to let you know, I've just been an admirer of your work as well. And for this episode, it took a lot of research. I
Mm,
had to really like make sure I don't be redundant with my questions because you've already been on so many other platforms and sharing
hmm
your story. So I want to make sure that we put a different spin
hmm
uh, to some of the conversations you've already had, which have been amazing conversations, by the
Thank you.
way. So I know that you were born in Virginia
hmm
to Palestinian parents,
hmm
but you grew up on the south side of Chicago.
Right.
Shout out little Palestine, right?
That's right.
One of six children.
hmm
So we got that out the way, but just help me fill the gaps. Talk to me about just the early childhood.
hmm So that little piece about me being born in Virginia and lived there until about third grade is not something, now it's out in the open. Anybody who meets me and knows me and gets to know me knows that I represent and I rep the South Side of Chicago hard, for many reasons. But I look at my life in what I call chapters or segments. Um, the first few years of my life until I was about third grade, I lived a pretty, average middle class life in Richmond, Virginia, in the suburbs of Richmond. Uh, Large extended family where I remember every weekend we had tons of cousins at somebody's house. They would rotate because I had my dad's family was huge. I have five uncles, four aunts, and each one of
Oh
them had
wow.
like five kids. So you could just imagine, like, Palestinians love to have their children. But that part of my life was very exciting. I had a lot of cousins. I was also, I wouldn't say athletic, but I like to be outdoors and play sports or ride my bike with a lot of my cousins. So it was a very good life until about third grade when we had an incident, and my mom's brother, my maternal uncle, um, got killed inside actually our house, which was very traumatic for us at the time. And when I look at events in my life, everything was a turning point. And there's something that happens that gets me to another place where I rediscover another part of myself. So when I was living in Virginia, I knew who I was. I was Palestinian. I think we were more Arab than we were Muslim. We weren't really practicing as much as we did when we moved to Chicago. My parents were immigrants. We knew a lot. I knew a lot about what was going on. I'm a child of the 80s. I'm showing my age, but, this is the height of the civil war in Beirut.
Right.
This is the height of the bubbling of the uprisings that are happening in Palestine and the West Bank. So there was a lot of that. I remember going to protests ever since I can walk, with my family, because it was a big part of our life. So when my uncle gets killed, we really had two options. My mom's sister had moved to Chicago to go be with her husband's family. And my mom wanted to go to Chicago. She didn't want to have anything to do with the house or Virginia, which I totally understand. And the other option was, at that time, majority of Palestinian families were sending their own women and children back to the mother country to get more of the culture, get a dose of the culture. We can't have them just living in America, not knowing who they are and the language and all of that. And now to the parents, it made sense because that's where they're from. They came to the United States, they did what they had to do, but they still had those connections. Well, we really didn't have an option. We really literally packed up in a couple of months and we were gone on a plane. And I remember waking up the next morning when we got there. It was really sunny. We were at my maternal grandmother's house, and there was a
Mhm.
wake for my uncle because we haven't seen everybody. And I'm looking around and I'm like, I'm in a totally different world. I knew I was Palestinian. I knew my grandmother because she would come visit. We used to go visit when I was younger, but I didn't remember. And it sat with me as I sat really literally under the sun. I can still feel it now. And I can sit here and think, this is my life. Like, I have to adjust to something different now again. And mind you, we are just coming out of all of this whirlwind that happened. So then we ended up
Right.
living in the West Bank for 3 years. I'm sorry. My mom knew education was extremely important, especially for her daughters. My mom was a fierce advocate. She's a beast of a woman, right? And so I'm the second of the six kids, the three girls and three boys. So my older sister and I, had we went to what you would call like the community school, they would have held us back because we didn't speak Arabic very well. So she didn't want
Mm,
that to happen. She didn't want us to have any learning gaps. So she advocated for my older sister and I to go to what is called the Friends Girls School. At the time, it was the Friends Girls School in Ramallah. And this is part of the larger Friends Quaker community. It's a very
of
old
course.
school. It started in the 1900s by, the Quaker mission. And my mom advocated and she got what she wanted. And my older sister and I ended up going there. And I think that was a huge cultural, political, and social shift for me in many ways. Number one, now I'm going to Ramallah, which is a major city in Palestine. I'm going to Old City Ramallah, which has a large Christian population, but it also has a large Armenian population too. So I'm learning more about my own people. I'm learning more about the diversity within the Palestinian culture. Number two, I go to a school that I didn't feel so alone anymore because all of the other students who were there were American students or kids who were born and
Hmm.
raised in America who got shipped off to the mother country too. And I'm like, oh, so we shared a lot of things in common from us being American, but also now as children of immigrants. But I also learned about the diaspora more. I met Palestinians who were living in the Virgin Islands. I met Palestinians who were from Denmark. I met Palestinians who were from Puerto Rico. I met like Palestinians from everywhere. And I'm like,
Wow.
damn, we're like everywhere. And then the third piece that really got me active, I think politically and socially, is almost all of my teachers were ex hippies. They were also Quakers. So
Right.
they taught us about the whole civil rights movement, the social justice movements, all of the songs, Bob Dylan, all of that. So I think my little hippie nature in me comes from them. So those were very pivotal points in my life. I always say, had I not moved to the West Bank and Palestine, I think I would have been a totally different person. Um,
Mm,
so that it wasn't easy, being away from my dad. My dad was in America. My mom was there raising like six kids at the time. My youngest brother was born there, and it wasn't easy. But when I look back at some of the things, I really feel that they were extremely pivotal pieces of my identity. And then the first Intifada breaks out in '89. And at this time, schools are shutting down, businesses are shutting down. It was really difficult for my mom to have to raise six kids in all of this anxiety driven environment. And she told my dad, we have to come back. And my dad is like, okay, so we don't go back to Virginia. My mom was like, I will not return to Virginia. And that's where we end up moving to the south side of Chicago, which, if everybody knows, has one of the largest Palestinian populations. And, they wanted to start a new life, something brand new.
yeah.
So that's how we got to Chicago. And that's the part of my life that kind of transpires into everything else.
And then you get to Chicago, and like
Mm-hmm.
I said, I really took some time and listened to like 3, 4 episodes or interviews that you
Mm-hmm.
did. And there was one part of your story that intrigued me. We get to Chicago, right?
Mm-hmm.
So you're in an all girls Muslim school, right?
Yes.
And here's the kicker, y'all. The principal is a former Catholic nun,
Yes.
and majority of the teachers there were white women.
Correct.
So when I hear what you mentioned about knowing who you were,
Mm-hmm.
being connected to your identity in terms of your faith, in terms of just your ethnicity, your nationality, and everything about you, right?
Mm-hmm.
And then you come into a space where you're seeing the educational leadership
Mm-hmm.
really not looking like you. And even from a faith standpoint, they're different, but yet you are able to have this almost this cross faith, cross racial solidarity in that space
Mm-hmm.
at such a young age. I'm wondering, how did that picture, and I know you were young at the time, but would you say that that was probably the harbinger for what was to come? meaning the work that you're doing right now, just seeing that picture?
I really never thought of it that way.
Yeah.
I never really sat there and until recently when I am engrossed in my own path as to what it means to be culturally responsive or what it means to put your student's identity first. Now that I look back at it, at my educational experience in a school that was for predominantly Arab children of immigrants who are Muslim, but taught by white women, and our identities were never really at question. And that speaks volumes to the fact that although these teachers, and we still are deeply connected to our English teacher, Mrs. Gates,
Mhm.
who we all follow on Facebook, because she was just such an amazing human being and really was, she taught us about empathy and she taught us about different perspectives, and our identity was never an issue for those teachers. I don't know, is it because they knew that was the school they chose to teach in, right? Like, why didn't they go to a public school or a Catholic school or whatever? And so seeing how the teachers interacted with us, but also developing our sense of self. I was very socially active when I was in high school. You have the war in Bosnia going on. You have what's going on in South Africa. You have a lot of the movements that are just going on in Chicago. And we have these teachers who are teaching us how to navigate those worlds because they knew what their privilege was and giving us that space to say, we know what will happen to us, but let us try to guide you to understand how to navigate the world based on how they see you. And I'm happy you said that, because now I'm thinking maybe that is how I got to where I am, because I was in an environment that was nurtured by people who didn't look like me, but that didn't matter because they accepted who we were and where we came from and understood our background and our community in order for them to be better educators. And I think it's very powerful to say that. And when I say our principal was an ex-nun, it was amazing because it shows that regardless of religion or what have you, when you're dedicated to your craft as an educator, everything else goes out the window. And you
Right.
did do your research very well. Yeah, that's a lot right there. But
Yeah.
yeah, but it's not to say that I didn't also have strong Muslim female teachers. I always owe my love for Arabic and my love for listening and reading the Quran, although I'm not superly religious, but those aspects to my teacher who was from Sudan, Layla Mekki, who I think was such a pivotal educator for me, because also, she came from a politically active family, but her strength and her resilience, and she never allowed us to just flounder. The importance of the language, the importance of learning it. I really owe a lot of that to her as well. So we did have a great combination of strong female presence in the school.
And as I'm thinking about just your story, just the interfaith connection that
Mm-hmm.
was there at your school, I just keep wondering, like, we're in a world where Islamophobia is just
Mm-hmm.
it just permeates our society. I mean, you see it within, with even some of our elected officials, right?
Mm-hmm.
You see it just in other parts of the globe. So to hear that story about what you experienced in school is just refreshing, because it
Mm-hmm.
lets us know that it's possible. It's possible for us to see past whatever differences we have, to really just to get to understand each other
Mm-hmm.
as humans, which is essentially what the work is all about. So, in saying that, I want to know from you, why do you believe that it's difficult for us to have that cross-racial, cross-ethnic solidarity? Because we talk about it, but there are certain barriers that get in the way of that truly happening, so we can combat some of these issues that we're speaking of.
When I read that question, it sat with me for a while.
Yeah,
I think number one, barriers in schools have always been created by other people. It's not
true.
necessarily something that existed in the school prior, but I think it's barriers that people create to either mask their own ignorance, to mask their lack of wanting to talk about a particular topic. Um, if we talk about schools or teachings and communities of color, you read about these things. Like currently I'm really engrossed in learning about like the black schools and black teachings from the turn of the 19th and 20th century, and how they developed and the genius that came out of it. And they talked about everything and they taught everything, so there was no sense of any question was off limits. I think when you have these barriers, they are definitely part of a system by design, where you were trained to go in, you teach, you do your job, and you leave. The sense of community has been taken out of teaching. The sense of humanity has been taken out of teaching, but also it's very steeped in privilege. I wrote an article years ago, and I should rewrite it in totally different forms, but I really truly believe that teachers who say we shouldn't be talking about politics or anything that's happening socially in schools come from extreme privilege, because there's no way that people who are talking about these in the classroom are not affected by it. And if it's not affected by you, your students are impacted by it as well. And
Right,
this
right.
article came out during that whole Muslim ban and all of that crap that came out. But when we have educators who don't want to talk about these issues, it's again because A, they do have privilege, but B, there may be something within themselves that they need to work on in order for them to get over the discomfort of understanding that these things are impacting, especially teachers of color and the students that you're teaching. So the reason why is because of those barriers that are man-made. And it really comes from the top down. What is your administrator? What is your ED? What are all those people telling you, and how to fall in line in order for you to be a good worker, to be, that person that doesn't, ruffle feathers and upset people. But then how are we expecting our students to be critical thinkers and critical of the world around them if we don't provide those spaces either? And if we're not allowing ourselves to grow and learn from each other. I'm not going to be in a classroom next to a person 5 days a week, 8 hours a day, and we ain't got nothing to talk about. Like, then why am I
Exactly.
here? Right? I mean, this is a school community. Why am I here? Are we just going to talk about what happened at the game yesterday or what you're going to go? And I don't even go to bars because I don't drink. Like, I ain't got nothing in common with you. And that's really hard for me as an educator and as a human being. Like, I consider myself an introverted extrovert, but once I get to know people and, we jive, we're going to talk a little bit more than just about what you did last night or on the weekend.
That's right.
There has to be that connection. So I know it's a long-winded answer, but I really think those barriers don't need to exist, because when you provide that environment where people are open and can talk about things and learn, make everything a learning piece. But the onus shouldn't always be on, again, the people of color to try to educate people. Like, you did your homework just for this interview, right?
I sure did.
Right. So why can't we see that with our teachers for our students, or even teacher to teacher? So I really think all of those barriers need to get gone.
And I think when we talk about really being engaged in anti-bias and anti-racist work,
Yes.
it's community work, and it requires you to really just learn the history.
Correct.
Like, if we're talking about cross-racial solidarity, you can go back to the late 60s. We think about the Asian American movements that were taking place out in the Bay Area, in Cali.
Yep.
And you can also look at the fact that there were Native students, there were Black students who were in solidarity with Asian American students. And from this, you had the first, I think, Black Studies program that was born at San Francisco State University.
Yep.
You also had a whole bunch of other programs that took place. I think maybe the first Asian American Studies program took place there as well. But it was around that time where you're talking about yellow power and everything else. So we have examples of that taking place. And then we're talking about Black History Month, but we'll also be mindful what's happening with the Israeli and Palestine conflicts too. You have Afro-Palestinians there too. And there's a history. I think Angela Davis talks about this. There's a history where you had Black folks and Palestinians in community together fighting these causes. So I'm just trying to wonder, how come we can't translate that? Why do
Hmm.
we have to compete in terms of like who's struggling more?
What they call the oppression Olympics.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah, and I do want to make one comment because words matter. It's really not a conflict; it really is a full-out war.
Yes,
I think when you say conflict, I would have a conflict with my neighbor. Tell their dog to stop crapping in my yard. That's a conflict, and you resolve it. There's power structure is pretty much the same, and that's again that's all by design. To go back to your first point, Kwame, and this really encompasses everything that we're talking about. Whether there are, we have Afro-Palestinians, and the Black community has always been in solidarity with the Palestinians. And I've said this before, and I'll say it ad nauseum. When people understand that when you stand for social justice and civil rights, you understand that this goes beyond who you are as a person and what it means for your community.
that's right.
And I always said this to my students. It wasn't called the Black, you know, a community movement. It was called the Civil Rights Movement because communities of color always understood the importance of that cross-cultural, cross-religious, cross-political identities, because that's what their communities come from. They are not linear. They are not one-dimensional. They are multifaceted. And unfortunately, this sounds like a broken record, but the concept of imperialism and colonialism has steeped so much within our communities that it's broken it down to make it seem like, oh, well, if you don't fight for me, I ain't going to fight for you. Or if you
Hmm.
don't stand for me, I don't stand for you. But also, it's gotten to the point where people who do stand, and I'm going to put in quotation marks, say for Black solidarity or Brown solidarity, sometimes use that to co opt their own racism towards other people. And we're seeing that happen with Palestinians. You have people who scream that they're, for social justice. There are people who are all about, health and wellness. But yeah, when it comes to Palestinians, well, the first words out of their mouth are, well, what about Hamas? Well, what about that? Like, there's always this what aboutism that they can't fathom to humanize or even sit back for a second and think about what's really going on and how it's going on and how it's still uplifting that system. But they themselves don't want to be considered racist, and they themselves don't want to be considered part of a system that's still upholding an imperialistic, colonialistic bastion in that part of the world, right?
That's right.
Because that's the theme, and that's the motto, and that's the story that they've been given. Just as we've been taught in American history, like manifest destiny, and this is ours. No, if you know your history, you know how that happened. So I think that's one reason why these come into play with our communities, is because it seeps into our psyche, where we know damn well as our communities we can't have freedom or justice without our brothers and sisters next to us, period. And we've known that for centuries. It's not like something that, all of a sudden just happened. No, we come from those communities. And why also it's so important for me as a historian and a history teacher right now to emphasize the importance of Black Muslim history, especially from the starting of kingdoms in Africa, is because it shows that cross-cultural movement between Arabs and Africans, and trade and skills and education, that for them, if you could, educate me, you can provide me with a good, income and a good life, we're good. But then you seep in and then you get into enslavement, unfortunately. But even that was skewed because the concept of who the people were that were enslaved was also steeped in all of that racist mentality that has to be untaught and unlearned as well.
So this season, Identity Talk for Educators Live will be including ad spots for businesses, products, and events that are adding significant value to their communities. And here's the catch: you don't have to be an educator or an education based business to be a part of this. We're looking for people who are just doing great work in the community, and we want to use our platform as a way to amplify their work. So if you are an entrepreneur or you know of an entrepreneur who is doing just that, bring them in our direction. Have them reach out to us. If they want to learn more about their ad spots and how they can get themselves promoted on this platform, they can contact myself, Kwame, at Kwame at identitytalk4educators.com. I'll say it one more time. It is Kwame at identitytalk4educators.com. Hope to hear from you, and let's keep on amplifying our work and building each other up. Yeah, for sure. And thank you for the call-in with the language, because language does matter. And just to add to what you're saying, what's happening right now, this is something that's been going on historically. It's not anything new.
Right.
There's been a history in terms of the Israeli occupation of Palestine, going back to, I think it was 1948, if I'm not mistaken. So you're
75
talking
years.
75 plus years of this going on, and there's a long history there. So just to provide that context historically, I think that's important. So just knowing all that, and this is the part that I want to get your perspective on, because as you know, there's been a lot of news going on about what's been happening on the Gaza Strip, and I don't understand why it's hard for folks to acknowledge, not just elected officials, but folks to acknowledge that, hey, like a ceasefire has to happen. Why is there such a hesitancy to just say what is the obvious? Because I've seen different clips. There was one clip in particular, I think it involved, it might have been AOC. Small clip, and she was doing an interview. I think you might have seen the clip as well. I'm not sure. They asked her about, well, what do you think about what's happening in the Gaza Strip? And she was just kind of going in circles. She was saying, well, we acknowledge that there are young people being killed and all this, but she couldn't say, no, there should be a ceasefire, like something that has to happen. Like she couldn't say that definitively. But it's not just her. There are a lot of people who we would deem to be more liberal, more progressive, who, when it comes to this situation, they're not following through the way you'd expect them to. So I'm just curious to get your take on some of the optics that you've seen.
I mean, well, Angela Davis, who is, I think, one of our most prolific activists and thought leaders to live, and I had the privilege of listening to her in person a couple weeks ago. Yeah, I'm going to throw that flex out. She wrote the book.
Should.
That's right. She wrote the book Progressive But for Palestine, and Mark Lamont Hill talks about it all the time.
Yes, he does.
So to go to the first part of your question about how can people watch all this happen and not ask for a ceasefire, studies have shown, media has a lot to do with this, and again, these are not new to anybody who understands how media works. It's very similar to the question of why can't police brutality stop towards Black people, especially young Black men, right?
Right.
It's because we've already put in the psyche of people this image of these beings. I'm not even call them human, because in people's minds, they're not human. I can disassociate myself from this group of people because I've been trained to know that they're terrorists, they're dirty, they treat their women like garbage. They don't come from backgrounds of, equal rights, no democracy. They don't know how to act, all of these things. And they've even done the research where I think in the 1980s up until the early 90s, there were over 900 movies that portrayed Arabs in such a negative deficit that it would take a long time to undo that. And growing up, all of those, macho movies and those war movies, they all take place in some form of landscape that really just shows this backwards, dingy, oppressive area, just as people think of the continent of Africa. Where now we know the continent of Africa has some of the most wealthy middle-class communities around, right? But again, it's taught in schools. When you look at curriculum, what do kids and students learn about the Arabs or the Middle East? And this is what I push for. They either start in Islamic Spain, where there's this whole utopia and all this ideas and these inventions that happen in a time that seems so out of our mind, out of our psyche, because it happened so long ago. Fast forward, Arabs and Muslims don't exist. And then what's the starting point? 9/11. So where is it in between that you're showing communities thrive, you're showing the trade, you're telling students that the reason why Columbus went the other way is because African and Arab and even Asian countries had an alliance and had the monopoly on trade to get to Asia, to get what they needed in India, but yet Europe was so arrogant they didn't even want to bother, hence the Crusades. So kids don't have this idea that there was all of this happening at the same time where their so-called Western countries are going to build themselves. They just think that it went from Islamic Spain, nothing happened, there's this vast nothingness, and then you get to 9/11. So there's nothing that in between that shows them that where did that come from? Where were Arabs before then? The thriving Arab communities in the United States as well. They've been here since the 1800s. And so all of that is from what you see in media, what's taught in curriculum. And again, it's by design. Who's creating those media types? Who's writing the curriculum? So going back to the question about why people can't see them, for years, me growing up, the first word you hear about Palestinians is they're what? They're terrorists. They blow people up. They can't govern themselves. You know, they're the ones who left the land. They couldn't take care of the land. Therefore, Israel had to be formed in order to take over. Look at this, desert that they made bloom. And so people automatically just think, well, they kind of deserve it. And they aren't worthy of being unalived, as people would say. And then to the second part, politics is politics. And, I think when people go into politics, there's parts of them that it's really hard to straddle what you really know is right and what you kind of have to do. And we're seeing this happen with Rashida Tlaib, the only Palestinian representative in Congress who got silenced for speaking about something that's fact. But yet we had an entire insurrection and it was cool. There was nothing that, nobody was silenced for that or nobody was put on pause for any of that. But yet that is something that they had to silence because it also goes into the deeper concept of it's not just basic human rights. We're also talking about money. When you start talking about people's money and how these conglomerates are going to lose, and you see the bigger picture as to why they're pushing so hard for this. I always told my students, follow the money. The Revolutionary War wasn't just about independence. It's about money, right? So all of these conflicts, you dehumanize people in order for those who have the upper hand to still have the upper hand and get what they want at the end of the day.
No, that's so true. And we still have so much Islamophobia going on, not just in our schools, but just the greater community. And yet we've had a Combating International Islamophobia Act that was enacted. But it seems like even though we have that down in law, Islamophobic actions are still persisting in our schools and in other settings. I actually saw a video of two hijabi. They were going for I think it was a campaign event. I can't remember who the candidate was. I think
No,
what
it was
you're
recently.
talking
They
about.
wanted to go see
Recently,
VP Kamala Harris go in.
thank you.
And they had tickets.
There you
And they
go,
had tickets.
Vice President Kamala Harris, and they were denied entry.
Right.
Denied entry, and they registered for this event just like everybody else. So they're interrogating. I think the man, I don't know if it was security, but I think it was a queer man who was there, and he was just saying, "No, you can't come in." And clearly, it was because they had on their hijabs. No one else did, and they were given entry. So to think that this is going on now and it's still happening in our schools where you have students being bullied because of their faith, when does it come to an end? When is it gonna stop?
Well, when our leaders take it seriously, when we don't allow people in power and who are leading an entire nation say certain things about communities that cause more harm or damage. I mean, I thought a lot of this is performative. You cannot have a policy with anti-Muslim hatred or Islamophobia or whatever people feel comfortable calling about it, but yet you're at the same time monitoring and doxing students at a pro-Palestinian rally. Or you have people in higher ed or even in schools harassing students because of who they are. And yet schools are like, well, I don't know. We really can't do much. I don't know what the policy is. Not until people really start taking those seriously, as they do for other incidents, will this end. And it's not going to end. Just recently in Orland Park, where my family and a lot of friends of mine reside in Orland Park, Illinois, there was a session where they wanted to ask for a ceasefire. The mayor
Right.
was blatant with his racism. And my answer to that is, why do these people think that they can say what they say, which is blatantly racist, and think it's okay? And the answer to that is because it is okay. Nobody's going to stop them. And they know it's not something that people are going to be, I hate to use the word up in arms about, but people aren't going to be, advocating, because again, when it comes to Arab and Muslim, especially students, and this is my biggest advocacy, is they are invisible in the eyes of their teachers, in the eyes of the school. Of course, they come off as white, unfortunately, with the census, which is changing. But at the same token, they're invisible because everything that's happening and that's in everybody's psyche, and the geopolitical stance that we have as a country towards countries that are predominantly Arab or Muslim, are the biases that teachers and educators bring in the classroom. So they don't see their students to be somebody, again, worthy of having some type of support, or even thinking about how what I'm saying or teaching is actually inflicting harm on my students. So if it's coming up from our leadership, again, with her denying two hijabis who have tickets, your questions like, why are you so afraid? What is it that you don't want to see or happen when those two female hijabis enter the room? And what is it about your own identity or your own thought process or your own ideologies that are making you question why those people are present? And again,
Right.
I
Those
always say,
implicit ideas.
absolutely,
Yeah.
absolutely. So, a lot of this is performative, but of course, they're not going to do anything about it because um, it's big business. Also, it's really big business. This whole anti-Muslim Islamophobia, it's a huge moneymaker for people. And when you put all this fear into people, people are going to pay for whatever it takes to make them feel comfortable. And now, we are the target. We've been the target.
So I want to switch gears a little bit.
Hmm.
So just thinking about just our schools, we follow the Gregorian calendar,
Hmm.
which means that we also follow Christian traditions throughout the year. Now, I'm wondering, because you're somebody who is taught in the school systems,
Hmm.
right, as a history teacher, and you're unapologetic about who you are,
Hmm.
and you know that these school systems operate under that calendar. So I'm just wondering, being who you are, how do you reconcile with the fact that this very system that you teach in invisibilizes those parts of your identity? How do you reconcile with that, knowing that it goes on and knowing that you might have some who share those same identities as you do?
Well, I never shied away from sharing my identity in the classroom or in the school.
That's right.
I always felt that if I was going to share my authentic self, that was so students would share their authentic selves. Middle school is a really tough time for students.
Right.
So helping them develop that has to come through modeling behavior and having those conversations. So, I mean, when I walk into a classroom and students see me dressed like this, automatically they're going to go all, it's all going to go sideways until we get to know each other. And then the conversation totally shifts, which is the beauty of creating those connections. So I never really shied away from my own authentic self and saying, okay, you don't want to recognize my holiday, which a lot of school districts are doing now with Eid and Ramadan. So I'm going to make sure that the law is being followed and you honor my request to be off, or for me to practice my faith the way I want to, such as Ramadan, or if students want to have a place to pray. The bigger issue with that is, again, I don't like things that are performative, where you have a school system that recognizes that, Eid is going to be on April 10th, but yet their curriculum is still steeped in anti-Muslim, anti-Arab rhetoric. So at one hand, we're saying, yeah, we recognize you and we're giving you this day off, but you're going to go back to a system in a classroom that still doesn't see or honor you. So for me, I would prefer to work on the deeper level of changing that within the curriculum, and how our students are being taught and identified, and how teachers are making connections with them first. And then we can get to that really higher level of saying, the reason why we're doing this is because we understand where you're coming from, why this is important to you, and why it's reflective of our identity as a school community. Now school districts are better at working to provide like Eid off and recognizing Ramadan and providing spaces for Muslim students. But even prior to that, I would, you have to advocate for yourself. And I was always fortunate to have administrators who understood. But for me, this is the argument I always have within my community, is the fact that I don't want that performative piece where it's on the calendar and it says, hey, look, we gave you all your holiday. It's on the calendar. You should be happy. I don't want the crumbs. I don't want crumbs, right? If you're going to invite me to dinner, I want the whole meal. So what I want you to do is, outside of identifying that we have this holiday on this month, what are you doing to unpack and create curriculum and spaces where you truly do see your Arab and Muslim students, where they're not going to be off on Eid for this one day, but then they go back to a classroom and that classroom is steeped in those negative stereotypes about Arab and Muslim students. Or you have students who are newcomers and they don't have the services that they rightfully deserve because you don't think that they deserve them. So there's a big difference between that performative nature, which is great, which a lot of people think, hey, that's wonderful, but it's not. Because again, it masks the opportunity for us to understand that when you're talking about a school climate and community, it goes beyond that calendar. It goes into how you're teaching your students, how you're approaching your students, what they're learning in the classroom, and how that is transferring into their own lives, and also with their peers, and what they can all learn from each other as well. So sure, you want to give me that day off, that's great, but I'm not going to go back to a toxic environment either. So which one is it going to be? And if I had to choose, I'd rather do the one where I'm changing the entire school climate, and then we can put it on the calendar.
It's so interesting you mentioned that, because I feel the same way about Juneteenth.
Yeah. Okay.
Like it's on the calendar, but yet we're still engaging in anti-Black actions within our schools. And it's manifesting itself in our curriculum. It's manifesting itself in the policies that we enact. It's manifesting itself in just the disparities in terms of just special education, in terms of discipline, just the school prison pipeline. And then what's ironic is we think about the history of Juneteenth and you look at Galveston, Texas, where it's all taking place. You think about what's happening in Texas right now. I mean, Texas is probably the most anti-Black state that we have in our country. But yet Juneteenth's a national holiday.
Right.
So the math ain't mathing over there. It just isn't. So I say all that to say I definitely feel where you're coming from with that. But I want to end off with a couple of positive questions here. First question being, what keeps you hopeful in your pursuit of liberation and justice for our most marginalized students in our learning spaces? How do you keep the faith?
Yeah, I would say a couple of things. I have been extremely fortunate to surround myself with amazing humans who accept me for all my craziness and all my, insanity that comes with it and my passion, but that they also are lock and step with me. It's so important in this work to have people who, like a colleague of mine, the other day was telling me equity breaths, and I have never heard that before. And I'm like, okay, she's like, you got to take an equity breath. Like, you can't do all of the work all the time because it'll kill you. So I think the first part of the hopefulness is surrounding myself with absolutely amazing, and like that term is very light for the people that I hang out with, who are just amazing. They know who they are. I don't have to say who they are, but they know it. So that's one thing. Another thing that I do, the kids are all right when I see what's happening on social media, when I speak to the younger kids and the passion and how they're unwavering in what they're doing. I'm like, damn, that's so powerful. And so though that really keeps me going, but the biggest thing that keeps me going is one thing that I decided to do now that I'm a consultant and I'm, my own person, is I work with a local middle school, because I need to have that energy and I need to be in there, but I also co-teach with another teacher. But going in, and I'm very strategic of the schools that I pick, and feeding off of the genius and the energy that I get from the students. And I love it because I go in there and they're like, I've only been there a couple of times, but we have that connection. But also just being in there and saying, the world is missing out on these students because they're
Right.
too busy thinking they're this or that, instead of coming in here and just seeing, watching them think and watching them analyze and watching them argue with each other and watching them dissect a particular topic. So I think those three are the most important to me. Like, my crew are really the people that when I'm frustrated or I'm having something happen, I can go to them, and they're the ones that could really help me pick myself up again. So yeah, I would say those three are the ones that give me hope.
And then my final question is, how does Abeer Ramadan-Shinnawi stay true to the teacher in her?
Ooh, I read a lot. Again, going to the people I hang out with, like it's almost like a competition of books that we read. But I also like to, again, that's why I'm in the classroom. I can't be an authentic teacher if I'm not with students, if I'm not with the teacher, if I'm not in that environment to really hone my skills and understand what it means to be a teacher. So always being close to the ground and close to a school, close to that environment outside of the reading and the professional development I do on my own. I have to be in there down and dirty because I can't call myself an authentic teacher if I'm not in the classroom and I don't know what's going on. And it's been 10 years and people look at me sideways like, when was the last time you stepped foot in a classroom? So I think that's
Hmm.
very important. How I stay true is being around students and schools.
Yeah, Abeer, thank you so much for taking the time to speak with us. This has been a great conversation. As I said in the beginning, I'm so honored that you came on to this space, and hopefully we can do that again in the near future.
I appreciate it. Thank you for having me here as well.
And then, of course, can't let you go without
Mm,
letting us know how we can connect with you on social media, but also talk to us about Altair
sure.
and the work you're doing there.
I have a love hate relationship with social media, to be honest. There are moments where I'm like, yeah, I'm going to post, I'm going to put this. And then there are moments I'm like, oh, screw it. I don't care. If people want to
I
know me,
feel
they'll
you.
know me. So for Instagram, I'm at Altair. I always forget what my handle is. That's how bad it is. But Altair Ed Consult, which is ALTAIRED Consult, CONSULT. And that's an abbreviation. So, really quick story about Altair, which has two meanings. Literally means bird. Altair in Arabic means bird, but figuratively it means to take flight. And I really believe
Mm.
doing my consulting has given me the wings to take flight, but also one of my themes is to amplify voices, and that's how we do it. I'm on LinkedIn. I have a website, eltiredconsult.com. People can find me there. I'm sure you'll probably put it in the notes. And just hit me up. I tell people I'm a human. Like, I want to connect. I'm not just like, hey, just saying it. So however people want to connect, I'm here for it. And, being in a space like this brings me a lot of joy and love the work that you're also doing, Kwame. So however we can both support each other, let's do it.
Uh, Thank you so much. And like I said, I hope we can do that soon.
Yes, definitely.
So, Beer, I hope you have a good rest of the day.
Yep.
And thank you again for coming on.
I appreciate it. Thank you, Kwame.
All right. All right, good people. So, we're about to end another episode of IDTALK4ED Educators Live. And as always, I wish you all good morning, good afternoon, good night, wherever you are in the world. We're going to do this again another time. Peace out, y'all.